Hello, everybody. I hope you've had a chance to grab some lunch. We have a few more people that are walking in, but we thought we'd get started. My name is Richard Kiley. I think I know a lot of people there, but in case you don't in the audience, but if you have never met me, Richard Kiley. I'm the Director of Engaged Learning and Research. If you've never heard of Engaged Learning and Research, you will today, a little bit, teeny bit. But we're in Caldwell Hall on the second floor, and I would welcome your involvement in our programs, and I hope you'd come visit us. You'll notice a lot of green. Once you see green, just follow the pipes, the green brick road. So I'm really pleased to be here to introduce an amazing group of graduate students who did a lot of work. They approached me in December 2012, early 2013, with an idea. This was after Engaged Learning and Research. The center was formed on in what ways can we better understand the needs, concerns, issues that affect graduate students around public engagement and their involvement in that. And it was very much an exploratory proposal. And so I thought it was a fantastic idea, and we had been doing a little bit of dialoguing with graduate students. I had a very active graduate student working with me, Courtney Knapp, who's no longer here. She's on the left coast in California, a nice faculty position for all you grads out there. And she did a lot of work, did a little bit, a survey that this report builds off of a little bit. She had done a graduate conference, a graduate student conference on engaged research as well, which she organized from Memphis, if I remember correctly. She was doing her field work. And so I would say that the four students that were heavily involved in this, Todd, John, Justine, and Melissa, spent a number of years, even overseas, collecting information about graduate students and their relationship to this public engagement initiative. So I have been really just, on a personal level, incredibly impressed with their devotion to this project, and it's taken a lot of time. They spent a lot of time revising the draft and getting more information and going to a conference in the UK to connect with other people who are thinking about this work and how it impacts graduate students. So I hope this is sort of the continuation of an initial conversation, but a bigger conversation around how we can support graduate students as we think about the larger public engagement initiative. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome the group to the podium. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Todd Dickey. Thank you, PhD candidate in Industrial and Labor Relations. Thanks so much, Richard. We really appreciate your support and Engaged Learning and Research support throughout this entire project. It has been a real journey, and it's one of those things where you don't know the road you're on until you're on it. So it's been really, really exciting for me to be on it, and has added so much to my graduate education in addition to my the other pieces of it. So thank you for that. Just wanted to also do some other quick thank yous. First and foremost to Melissa Rosario, who is one of our co-authors, who is no longer here because she's a postdoc at Bowdoin College. She sends her best to the group and is here in spirit. Also, Richard has been amazing to work with at EL&R, but he has, I think what makes EL&R really work is the amazing team that he's functioned, that he's brought together to make EL&R work. So just wanted to give a shout out to Wendy, Annalisa, Kathy, Sarah, Daniel, and the rest of the team at EL&R for supporting this project from its inception and really bouncing off ideas and supporting it with us. Richard mentioned briefly our trip over to the UK. We were invited, the four of us were invited to participate in an international doctoral seminar in action research at the University of Bristol, invited by Mary Bryden Miller of the University of Cincinnati and Patricia Guy of the University of Bristol. We can talk a little bit about that in the discussion, but that was a really amazing piece to see how Cornell connects to the larger world of public engagement and action research, and we've made some really amazing connections there. We also wanted to thank David Greenwood, who is the former advisor of the Cornell Participatory Research Action Network, or Action Research Network, which we are all 4 members of. David recently retired in December from Cornell, and I think is now in Spain enjoying his family, but he's also here in spirit with us and sends his best. We also want to thank Bradley Kinsey, who was a graduate fellow at ELNR and a master's student in architecture, who served as our graphic designer, and also we say our moral support throughout the entire process, been there with us from the beginning. And then also the graduate school for providing AV support, so this presentation and discussion can be cataloged. And lastly, we want to thank all of our studies participants. We'll talk more in depth about who they are in a bit. So with that, let's just jump right in. As you'll see, we have the executive summary of our report out, and we're going to be sending the PDF copy to those who've signed in, and it'll be publicly available on our website and Cornell's website. But we start off the report with a really kind of framing question and picture, and we call it the ascendancy of public engagement. And just as a quick little brief, this is a graph. It's a Google Ngram, which John has helped me understand what this is. It's really cool. This is Google's own search of its books, so the Google Books. And it's detailing the rise of the term engagement, public engagement, community engagement. There's a few different iterations that are mixed in here between 1960 and 2008. And you'll see, starting in 1990, with Ernest Boyer's Scholarship Reconsidered book publication, you'll just see this amazing spike in terms of the rise. If we have specific questions about that, John can answer this, because he's been working with this data a lot more than I have. But again, public engagement we found is becoming a larger and larger part of not only our university's discourse, but universities across America in recent years. We detail in the report many different findings about why that's the case, and one of them particularly is the Carnegie Foundation's creation of the Institution of Community Engagement category in 2010. The foundation developed a classification of engaged institutions of higher education, and Cornell, like many of our peers, applied for this designation and was granted it. Also, connecting public engagement with Cornell's areas of strength in research, scholarship, and education is one of the university's 7 strategic priorities, and its 2010 to 2015 strategic plan, which we're going to talk a lot about in this report presentation as well. But ultimately, there's a lot of different metrics that we can use to talk about the rise of public engagement at Cornell. But personally for me, and I think some of the other team members, I think we knew public engagement hit it big time at Cornell when the land grant tab was replaced on our homepage with one that said public engagement. And we can talk about that framing in the discourse. But I think if you make the homepage, you've really made it in terms of entering the Cornell discourse. And that happened a couple years ago. So what is public engagement? It's a wide range of activities and approaches, but it can often be amorphous. It can often have different meanings to different people. We're going to talk more in depth about what our report found, and you'll see in the report, but often there is notions about service, outreach, service learning that's included in this definition. But for the graduate students who are in research-oriented graduate programs, so MS or PhD programs, the major activity for us in our programs is research. And so therefore, we really wanted to take a step back and look at public engagement from the research lens, the research angle, which many of the scholarship and the discourse around public engagement here at Cornell and at other universities hasn't really been addressing to the same level and extent. So in that vein, our study had the following 2 objectives. First, we were interested in understanding how graduate students interested in publicly engaged research conceptualize the meaning and purpose of public engagement in their own research and disciplines. And we were interested in the specific ways that Cornell's institutional context supports or constrains graduate students' publicly engaged research endeavors. So the goal was to really understand these two objectives in a way that would allow us to make recommendations to the university as it piloted the EL&R program and center, and then we're thrilled to be here today as the university has launched its Engage Cornell initiative and endowment, which was launched in October of last year. So we can talk about that in terms of the discussion, but that's a major development that didn't happen when we started this process. So we feel the timing for this conversation really couldn't be better. As Richard alluded to, the university and EL&R did conduct a survey of the entire Cornell graduate population in 2012 called the Graduate Student Engagement Survey that kind of look at trends across graduate students in all programs about how they related to the university's goal of public engagement. But in this study, we made a particular decision to focus on the experience of graduate students who were already identified as being actively involved in publicly engaged research or were actively interested in publicly engaged research. So it's not a census of all graduate students, and rather much more targeted, and we can talk about why we decided to do that. So to really get into the experiences of these particular graduate students at Cornell, we conducted focus groups and individual interviews with about almost 50 Cornell community members from January to June of 2013. We interviewed graduate students in colleges, CALS, Arts and Sciences, AAP, Industrial and Labor Relations. We weren't able to interview students from Human Ecology or Engineering, but invited students to participate in sessions. Focus group sessions, unfortunately, they were not able to attend. We also interviewed several faculty, extension associates, and administrators who are all actively involved in Cornell's public engagement efforts. We also did not interview any non-Cornell affiliated community members or organizations, again, because we were focused really inward on this study, looking at how Cornell's own graduate students and administrators and faculty were dealing with this, although we think that's a very important component and are excited to look at that in future research. And then lastly, we conducted a close reading and discourse analysis of 12 university documents related to public engagement and the university's strategic plan. All right, so jumping right in. So what is publicly engaged research? It's a good question, and I think this cartoon kind of does a really good job of showing the variety of what can be labeled engagement. There's no one definition, and we all agree that that's a good thing. Our research found that the graduate students here at Cornell have a variety of ways of conceptualizing public engagement and publicly engaged research. Actually, and an interesting finding, we'll talk about this more later too, is the term public engagement. A lot of graduate students, several we've talked to, really felt somewhat disconnected from that term. So often what we heard from our interview and focus group participants when they're talking about their own research, rather than say, I do publicly engaged research, they'll say, I do collaborative or participatory or democratic or action research or community-based research. And we can talk about how those all merge. Do they all merge into publicly engaged research or don't they? I think that's the kind of conversation we need to have around this in our community. Another interesting finding was that almost every graduate student who participated in our study didn't realize that Cornell had made connecting public engagement with Cornell's areas of strength in research, scholarship, and education actually a strategic priority that it included as one of its 7 strategic priorities in its current strategic plan. So they actually learned about that in our focus groups and interviews. But as we say in the report, when kind of talking about the university's role in public engagement, and I'm quoting from the report, it was important to many students that engaged research is not just a rebranding, but potentially a radical reframing of the research endeavor that requires researchers to make publicly accountable choices at every stage of the research process and sharing control. So in this vein, we are offering a working definition of publicly engaged research in a report, but we also advocate for the university to continue to work with the graduate students and the larger community to continually revisit and engage around the definition of public engagement. So we're never, I think we all agree that it's better never to reach that perfect definition, but privilege the process of continual conversation. And in the discussion, we'll be happy to talk about our definition in a little more detail if folks have questions about that. And just lastly, before I turn it over to Justine and John to talk about the recommendations we're making to the university, I wanted just to take a minute to talk about the history of public engagement and the land-grant mission here at Cornell. As you'll see on this slide, we have Liberty Hyde Bailey, a former dean of Cal's, breaking ground for the old Roberts Hall. Now we're at new Roberts Hall. And just we put him up there because we really do believe he was a true champion for the land-grant spirit. And also this connection, and personally this was really an important learning moment for me throughout this whole process, is that even though the term public engagement may be new to Cornell, it really isn't new to Cornell. It's really interwoven into our history. And just because it wasn't called public engagement, I think it's really interesting to think about our past and where we are now. As folks in the room know, Cornell is New York State's land-grant university, chartered under the 1862 Morrill Act, and thus we're mandated to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions in life. That's a quote from the Morrill Act itself. So the democratizing effect of the Land-Grant Act was to give the New York State legislature the ability to create the statutory colleges at Cornell, Vet, ILR, Human Ecology, CALS, or what we like to call the People's Colleges, as named by the historian of Cornell's land-grant efforts, Ruby Greensmith, in her classic book from 1949. They were created to directly serve the people of New York. So for many of our studies participants and those in the Cornell community, the statutory colleges were where the land-grant mission or the land-grant spirit resided. The traditional example for many folks was ILR extension and cooperative extension, and this notion of extending the research of the university into New York State and beyond. But we note in the report that in the past several years, the university has directly intervened to attempt to broaden the definition of the land-grant mission. As chairman of the Board of Trustees, Robert Harrison, stated in a 2012 video produced by the university, and I quote, "Some people think that we have land-grant colleges, and in fact, that's not true. Our university is a land-grant university, and every department, every discipline, every area, major and college, has the same obligation, the same public service mission." So what we see with Bob Harrison's quote here is an attempt to broaden the standard of the Cornell narrative of what the land-grant mission is. But to many of our participants, the standard narrative did still hold sway, as they didn't often see the university acting like a land-grant university and prioritizing its public service mission across all departments of the university. Instead, participants frequently saw public service more in terms of outside funder dictates, such as NSF or NIH funding dictates that require outreach on large grant-funded projects that the university wants and needs faculty to obtain. And many grad students didn't feel that they were often asked to be included in the university's land-grant mission, no matter what field they were in. We also take some time in the report to look back at the innovative work the university was doing before public engagement officially entered our vernacular. And I'm just going to touch briefly on a little bit, and I know there's a lot of wealth in this room that knows the history as well. But Farmers Institutes from the 1880s I think that was the earliest project that we found as a team that brought graduate students together with farmers and extension associates to learn from each other. There are many more. I'm going to kind of continue on to, we can talk about that more later, but also, we also found that our studies participants expressed some remorse that they were not connected more with Cornell's 2 longest-term strategic public engagement assets, which we call cooperative and ILR extension. Some graduate students we interviewed discussed working with cooperative extension on outreach materials, but none discussed being involved with the more collaborative and dynamic approaches to extension and adult education consonant with the mission of public education. Cooperative extension, we argue, has a wealth of knowledge and experience in these areas which students can learn more from, and John and Justine will be talking more in depth about that. Switching to the ILR extension side, we do a short case study of an ILR extension program called PEWS, Programs on Employment and Workplace Systems, which was in operation for about 20 years, from about 1985 to 2005. And that program aimed at researching labor management collaboration, participatory work practices, and organizational development and change through research, consulting, and facilitation. Since I'm an ILRE, very close to my heart, all of those things. Looking back at that program was a really good way to look at relationships between graduate students and extension, because many faculty administrators we spoke with who were around when PEWS was still operational argued that PEWS put a specific emphasis on involving graduate students into the organization's efforts. One participant in our study said, graduate students are the natural connection. They are the glue at PEWS. We're at PEWS because the program is no longer in operation. Graduate students working with PEWS in both ILR's professional master's program, the MyLAR, as well as its PhD program, were central partners in designing and conducting field research with the partnering organizations. Graduate students kept faculty in the loop and extension associates and informed and encouraged involvement from a broad spectrum of actors. One of the reasons PEWS was so successful is because it funded at least one RA-ship every semester for a PhD student that would replace the normal ILR funding packages, which would usually have a student TA a course or RA for a resident side faculty member. But what PEWS did, rather than taking this as just an RA and kind of here are your assignments, go to it, they used the opportunity to include the graduate students as a staff member in the PEWS group. So graduate students would attend staff meetings and help collaboratively determine the direction of the program. Soon this RA-ship became a coveted one for publicly engaged graduate students at ILR. But several interviewees told us that the program's success also led to its demise, as resident faculty members were concerned that graduate students who received PEWS funding were not TAing for them, and they weren't working on resident side faculty members' research projects. That is to say, the PEWS RA-ship was judged solely to be extension work by some, and therefore not beneficial to students' academic development as researchers. As a published case study by David Greenwood and Morton Levin of PEWS in the mid-2000s, the two argue, ILR resident, and I quote, ILR resident faculty moved to aggressively eliminate PEWS entirely. Many of its key personnel left, and the rift between extension and research has grown even deeper. We note in our report that ILR has done many strategic initiatives around its institutes to try and bring those relationships back together since the time of PEWS closure in around 2005. But we believe that the history of PEWS is really instructive to cooperative and ILR extension because we have the strategic infrastructure and we have history that shows us what is and isn't working for graduate education and really bridging these connections. So we encourage the university to really think as we think strategically about moving forward, thinking strategically about analyzing our past. But we are extremely encouraged by our history, and John and Justine will talk more about how we believe extension and graduate education can really advance the land-grant spirit and mission of our university. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justine, who's going to begin to discuss the recommendations that we have for addressing these issues to strengthen graduate student publicly engaged research and public engagement. So with that, Justine, thank you. Yeah.
Excuse me, thank you all for being here, and thanks Todd for opening it up for us. I'm stealing your power cord. Like I said, I'm notoriously soft talker.
Oh, that's not in.
It's okay.
Okay, there we go.
Is that good? Okay. Can everybody hear me? People always say I talk very softly, so if you can't hear me, just give a shout. So like Todd said, we spent a long time talking with grad students, with faculty, with extension members, with administrators, and had a long list of findings. Our report was initially something crazy, like 75 pages long, and we're like, nobody's going to read this. So I'm not going to read you 75 pages. I'm going to try to concisely present some of the stuff that we found and some of the recommendations that we came up with. I suppose I could go on. Here we go, recommendations. So this is going to come as no surprise that funding is a huge barrier to doing the kinds of research that we want to do, and this is across the university. Basic research, traditional research, engaged research, funding is always a barrier that makes it sound really pessimistic. It's a challenge. It's something that you have to wade your way through. So at Cornell and at other institutions, funders often are seeking a certain model of grant applications that follow a traditional or basic science model. And so it is very hard through traditional funding mechanisms to fund engaged research. There are some out there. We have found, and our research participants found, that it is really difficult to secure the kinds of high-level funding that you might be able to secure through NSF or NIH, USDA, to do the kinds of engaged research that a lot of grads at Cornell are looking to do. So we're really, really excited about the potential for ELNR internally to more robustly fund some of the research that grads are doing at Cornell, really expanding the objectives of engaged Cornell. And we really recommend, and our research participants really recommend, that graduate student work is emphasized and supported in the expansion of ELNR. Right now there's a really robust emphasis on undergraduate community-based research and service learning, and we'd really like to see that extend to the graduate level and have a stronger connection between ELNR and the graduate school. As Todd mentioned, extension, cooperative extension, and ILR extension are both also really amazing opportunities for us to do the kinds of community-based research that a lot of students are trying to do. And to that end, I guess I can go ahead. Here we go. Sorry. So to that end, we would recommend that the university really start actively seeking increased state and federal support for extension, and start trying to support extension through centrally funded graduate student assistantships and fellowships. Extension associates have, very charged schedules and are incredibly busy. Providing them with the space, time, and financial resources that they need to be able to really mentor and work with graduate students, we think would be a really mutually beneficial investment that the university could make. So next up, I don't know how many amongst you have heard of the Land Grant Fellowship. It's maybe not quite as widely advertised as it should be, because it's a really amazing opportunity for statutory college graduate students to do have 1 or 2 year fellowships doing community-based research, working with extension. And so we'd like to see an expansion of the Land Grant Fellows or the fellowship program. As Todd mentioned, there's sort of a difference in notion about what exactly it means that Cornell is a land grant, whether it is only the ag school, the vet school, and ILR, or if it extends to the entire university is up for debate. But we think that the opportunities that the statutory college students have to be a part of a land grant fellowship should be extended to the entire university, which would be a way to really involve students from across the university in the engaged Cornell mission. And then we'd like to see funding of small grants for collaborative research purposes, and this sort of ties into what I'm going to talk about next, which is to grow the sort of network of graduate students doing participatory and engaged research. Small grant competitions could foster institutional, local collaborative research for students carrying out year-long or maybe semester-long research projects on a specific topic. They could be at differing levels. They could be group grants, individual grants. What that might look like exactly is, up for debate. But this could really foster like a deepening of graduate students' engagement, both with ELNR and amongst each other. We'd also like to see, that's not what I thought was going to come up next. That's okay. We'd also like to see an engaged research travel fund, both domestically and internationally. And especially, like I said, engaged research, those concentrating on community engagement and participation. It would really increase the possibility of doing community-based engaged research for many students. ELNR currently does have they offer research travel grants, and we'd like to sort of see a deepening and widening of these grant opportunities, both within ELNR and across the university. One example of this would be, there we go, that's what I thought it was going to be, and funding off-campus training opportunities in terms of community-based research, in terms of sort of collaborative mentorship with community members and university members to try to bridge that gap, which I hate saying gap, like it's not really a gap, but to sort of bring together students on campus doing research and the communities with whom they're doing the research. So one of our next really big findings was that graduates at Cornell, a lot of the graduates we talked to sort of thought of themselves in this very atomistic, individualist academic environment where it's a sink or swim kind of a mentality. You come here with your research project to do your research, and you figure out how to do it. You find the people who can help you to do it, and what students were really sort of seeking was a more networked and involved community of graduate students that would really support each other and foster more connections between students. And you see that in certain places. There's the laboratory sort of mentorship model in some of the physical sciences, and there are some social sciences and particular professors or departments that encourage that lab model of sharing work and critiquing each other's work. But we really think that our research and future careers would benefit from more opportunities to work with and bounce ideas off of other graduate students. And it could also involve, in a sense, community members and the ways in which we engage with community members. So to that end, we thought it would be a really good idea to formalize, instead of having informal support networks that a lot of grads are currently seeking within their departments and across departments, to formalize a public engagement student research cohort network inspired by the lab model that you see in many of the natural sciences. New students would be mentored and guided by more senior students, and also working with professors in this sort of lab model, cohort model. But the real important thing is that what we heard from a lot of our research students is that you learn so much from the experiences of other graduate students. So to go through this whole process, whether it's 3 years or 7 years, and to do it without the support of a cohort of students that have gone through it before you, especially when you're aiming to do something that's maybe outside of the norm of traditional research paradigms, is really difficult. So to establish something of a cohort model, a formalized cohort model, is one of the main recommendations that we had. Similarly, we heard from a lot of people that mentorship is something that they were actively seeking in their sort of journey as publicly engaged scholars. There are professors on this campus doing really amazing community engaged work. There are extension members, people working with CCE within ILR and CALS, and doing really amazing work, and it's hard to find them. They are very busy people, and it would be really amazing and beneficial, we think, to both sides to integrate mentorship programs, trainings, provide the resources necessary to people to establish better mentorship relationships, and provide better foundations for these strong networks between grad students and between grads and faculty. And then lastly, strengthening relationships with national engaged research consortiums. Not only are individuals on Cornell campus not the first ones to go through community engaged research sort of trajectories, but Cornell campus is not the only university in this country or in the world doing this kind of work. Places like Michigan State, University of Georgia have really amazing models of graduate student fellowships and consortiums and mentorships, and to be inspired by these programs and to reach out and sort of collaborate with these programs can only really be beneficial to everybody involved. Research consortiums like Imagining America, which is now seated at Syracuse University, and we're lucky enough to have Scott Peters here at Cornell again, provide an excellent model for community-engaged research. Spans a network of dozens of universities, I think over 100 universities across the US, and provides graduates doing publicly engaged scholarship with the opportunity to work with and learn from each other. So those are the two of the big sort of thematic areas that we found in our research: funding opportunities and graduate student networks. John is going to come up and talk about some more recommendations that we had in terms of institutional support and networks. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Christine. All right. Can everybody hear me fine? Yeah. All right, good. Good afternoon. So far we've been speaking of graduate students as if they exist in a bubble, and a lot of times we might think that we exist in a bubble, but we really don't. It really takes a village to support graduate student engaged research. And so this last area of recommendations, I'll really just focus on that. First among these, let's see if I can do this right, is to increase faculty strength in this area of engaged research. This really has three parts that I'm going to discuss quite quickly. They center around tenure and promotion, hiring, and course grants. One of the biggest asks that we have is that in order to secure faculty lines for engaged research, we need to revisit our guidelines for tenure and promotion. In order to sort of really reflect the institutional value of engaged research, we have to have that reflected in the structure of tenure and promotion. We point to at least 3 such examples of tenure and promotion documents in our report. One of them from Imagining America, another one from Campus Compact, and another one from the University of Syracuse, which all point in this new direction, which would really help us as graduate students be able to find faculty that are both interested in and able to do engaged research and find support for that. The second ask is around hiring. Given Cornell's current and future hiring trends, we really think that Engaged Cornell should have an active involvement in trying to influence in some way the hiring of new professors that have experience in engaged research. Lastly, course grants. One of the things that graduate students will find it hard to do as they enter into Cornell is to find courses that really reflect the methods and the ethics that they're trying to operate under while they do engaged research. Within our study, there were a number of points where this particular recommendation came to light. Chief among them, I would say, is just a lack of professors that were actively involved in engaged research or were public about their involvement in engaged research. We had some students and faculty members that discussed actively de-emphasizing their focus on engaged research because they were fearful that it would impact their tenure and promotion lines. Secondly, it's just, it's hard to find courses, and students reflected that. A lot of the training that we receive in engaged research methods is autodidactic. We are teaching ourselves how to do this work, and that's exciting to some degree. Graduate students are really excited to be able to do that work, but it's not necessarily what we signed up for. And so having more courses available in engaged research is a really big recommendation for us. And in particular, we point to one course that we'd like, which is around engaged research ethics. Okay, moving on. We talked a lot already about bolstering graduate students' relationships with extension, and I won't cover that too much here. We did focus before on graduate student funding packages that support their work with extension, but in that same vein, extension needs support to work with graduate students. We take a lot of time and effort to train. And if we do consider that Extension knows something about this work of engagement, we should recompense them for it. And so that's a big focus of that latter recommendation as well. And lastly, we just want to invite a deeper graduate student involvement within engaged learning and research and engaged Cornell. I'll scroll down in my notes just real quickly. 2 years ago, when we began this work, as Todd mentioned, we would approach graduate students about this idea of engaged Cornell, engaged learning and research, and many of them haven't heard of those institutions before. Now, I'd imagine that a lot of that has changed, but anecdotally, I do think that graduate students, by and large, don't have a large involvement in engaged learning and research or engaged Cornell, and we'd really like to see that reflected in some of the structures that we're building around this idea of engagement. In particular, we'd like to ask that 2 graduate students be involved in the new public engagement council that's being put in place at the university. We'd have students that would be able to reflect graduate student interest, as well as report back to the graduate student body on developments that are in front of the council. Okay? Okay, so now I'm gonna just add some concluding thoughts. A lot has changed. When I came to Cornell 5.5 years ago, there was no EL&R. There was no engaged Cornell. There was no funding to speak of, at least at the scale that we're talking about now. And there were few administrative documents that really highlighted this central ethic and value of engagement being central to the institution here. But a lot still remains the same. Entering grads, like when I was an entering grad 5.5 years ago, I had to navigate my way through this institution to find how to do engaged research. I had to find the right courses. I had to find the right mentors. And to some extent, that's what graduate students have to do today as well. There's no real formal network that graduate students can tie into and find some of that support that they need. To some extent, the graduate school, in some ways our representative body, its relationship with engaged Cornell and engaged learning and research isn't that clear to me as a graduate student, and that's something that might need to change. Another thing that remains the same is that in a lot of ways, administrative pushes are still often led by a smaller group of people at the top of an institution. That's somewhat still the same. And I think that public engagement really welcomes a new way and a new ethic of conversation around these initiatives. And we'd really like to see that come to the fore. And I think I want to be the first to acknowledge that I realize that a lot of this requires big level work. This is a big challenge. And I applaud everyone involved in this initiative for how well they've been able to meet that challenge amidst a lot of competing accountabilities. It's a big challenge. But graduate students are ready for big changes. Not only are we ready for big changes because in many ways our job prospects require that we be ready for big changes, but also in many cases that's what we signed up for. A friend of mine once said that big changes, big challenges, good questions require help. And I guess the last point is that we as graduate students are very excited to help. Okay? So, thanks. One final bit of closing is I'd really encourage everyone, if they can, to read the report. There's a lot in it. It's 50 some odd pages, and we can't cover all of it here. But we'd really like to welcome your feedback, and we hope that this can be a good sort of benchmarking activity for what we do next. There are a lot of concrete recommendations in this report that we'd like to see through in preferably a shorter amount of time. And so we hope that this can be a good basis for that discussion. What I'm going to do right now is just sort of try and figure out a way we might start that discussion here just a little bit. We have a recording device in our midst, and we'd like to get some of people's reflections on tape. so that we can share this with the broader Cornell community that wasn't able to make it here today. Okay? All right. Todd, do you want to realize your vision?
I was thinking in the spirit of public engagement, we might form a circle, but that's, in our minds, we'll have a circle.
Okay. So do we just want to do a normal question and answer sort of format? Sure.
Yep.
Okay. Maybe what we'll do is just come up to the front and take some questions from the crowd. Feel free to not only make it questions, but comments. Feel free to lob a question at someone else in the room if you think they have a better answer than you. So yes, Mary Jo, you had your hand up. Yes.
Yeah, I had a couple of comments and questions. First of all, thank you for doing this work. I realize it's taken a lot of time to do that. And I had just a couple of reflections and questions. I was curious why you only identified ILR extension and cooperative extension, because sitting in a CALS extension, I see this as a constant tension. And just so graduate students are aware, most of us who work in extension have to raise our own salary. So we're making a decision about where our time is going to go because it's structural. So that's just to put out there why just a certain group. And then another, I have a couple other things to just add to that. And so one of the critical pieces is in looking at Engaged Cornell, it's precisely those people who are engaged in the community through extension who, from the outset, will not have access to those funds. Because the structure is that that's a funding structure for tenure and tenure track faculty. So that's a big issue just to kind of think about. And then just one other reflection be quiet, is that CPARN actually was formed as a way for faculty and graduate students to interact. There's a lot of faculty interaction in that, and so I'm kind of wondering in terms of just sort of what changed over time, what might change over the future, because that was a very, I think, effective forum for collaboration as equals. It was you know, something like that. So anyway, those are just my reflections and questions.
Just like the focus on ILR.
Yeah, I can do that, and then turn it over to you to do that.
When do you?
I'll start with the extension piece, and thank you so much, Mary Jo, because I think that the extension, we only touched like 0.0005, in terms of what we could talk about in this report in terms of all of the extensions, but we really are talking about all extension. We only did one case study in the report, and it was ILR, but there are many stories that we heard throughout our research that in the rest of CAL's cooperative and debt in terms of extension.
Just thinking about how you might articulate that in your recommendation so it isn't seen as narrow ILR or cooperative extension.
That's really helpful. Yeah, but it was across the entire spectrum, so thank you for that clarification.
In terms of the funding structures of Engaged Cornell and the ways that those funds are accessible, at the time that we were writing this report, a lot of that had not yet come to light, and I'm not familiar with all of the ins and outs of how that works. However, I do know that there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration between departments and professors and extension and institutions, and the extent to which that collaboration actually happens, remains to be seen. And I know that it's often the case that the institutions through which funding is filtered, are the departments or the tenure track professors. And there's a problem in that, that is a problematic structure in that, it sets up a hierarchy of power and privilege within the institution as to who has the real access to money. And perhaps down the line it won't be that way, but for now I'm thinking that, the kinds of collaborations that can be fostered through course grants and the RFPs that have been put out through Engaged Cornell could set a really good example.
And just briefly to touch on the bit about CPARN, I don't know if everybody recognizes that acronym, but it's the Cornell Participatory Action Research Network. Its history started in 1992, I believe. It was one of the first action. You're shaking your head.
It was before then.
Before then. But it was also one of the first sites for action research on the internet, and it had a great impact on documenting the sort of rise of literature on action research as an entity at Cornell. But it was also this great place where students got the mentoring community that they really needed to do this work well. And it involved a number of faculty members. CPARN sort of died out in the mid-2000s. And there are a lot of reasons that people can point to for why it did. But in 2010, Courtney Knapp, who Richard mentioned earlier, revived CPARN. And it's been a small cadre of students ever since then. And for the past 2 years, we've been doing a lot of work that's been centered on this report. One, because we think it's timely, and to some extent there may not have been that much we had to teach each other at that point in time. But I think that that's a real big focus for us now in thinking about how we might leverage some support for this from this new idea of public engagement into CPARN or into another entity that might serve a similar purpose. But I think that that's a big discussion for us now. We talked a lot about how graduate students navigate this arena in very informal ways. And it doesn't need to be that hard to find the right courses or to find the right mentors. And to make that transition easier, we're hoping that CPARN can revive itself to some degree. And maybe another institution can walk in and take over some of those mantles. We do recognize that participatory action research and action research is a particular brand of engaged research, and we may want to consider it more broadly than that. So these are all on the table for discussion as far as how graduate students can be their own support group. And the faculty bit is huge for me. To some extent, it might be hard to find faculty that are brave enough to enter that space at times. So that's a difficult thing.
Well, just going back, that was a joint faculty-student space. So I don't know if it's a question of people being brave enough. I mean, I think the issue is really thinking about whatever space, if it's that or a new space, thinking through what are meaningful ways for people to be involved.
That's right.
Whatever they are.
I agree.
I think one of the struggles with CPARN, and clearly I was not here in the early to mid 2000s.
Justine, could you speak up a little bit?
Sorry.
Thanks.
I think one of the struggles with CPARN is that it has heavily relied on individuals to keep it going, and it has heavily relied, at least in the past few years, on individuals to sort of rekindle it and bring people together and be the conveners. Professors who have retired and have we've lost a lot of institutional knowledge as people have left. And so I think in moving forward, it behooves us to find ways to not have to continually reinvent the wheel, to not have to continually be seeking support and people and recruiting, and to have a structure, and I'm not sure what that might look like, but to have a structure that sustains itself a little bit better than what CPARN has been able to do in the past several years. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts more on that.
Yes. So thank you very much for all the effort that's gone into this, and I hope that this is the first of many conversations. So I have a lot of questions, but one question is, who did you talk with in the graduate school, and what did you learn from the graduate school's view on your interests and recommendations?
So I'll go ahead and talk to them, because that is a connection that we didn't make at the beginning of this research. It's a curious thing as to why that didn't enter into our mind. I just started a conversation with the graduate school last week. That's how long of a conversation we've been having with the graduate school. And one of the areas of concern is that folks I talked with at the graduate school didn't necessarily know how they were involved with Engaged Cornell or Engaged Learning and Research. And some of that may be due to different reporting lines within the university. I know Richard is, and that program, you can clarify if I'm wrong, but I know that you all report directly to the Dean for Undergraduate Students, right? In a large capacity. And so that might influence like graduate schools' involvement within this question or within these institutions. I'm not exactly sure what conversations Engaged Cornell or Engaged Learning and Research has had directly with the graduate school, but I did talk to them about a couple, basically it was an organizing conversation talking about what are their interests as regards this report, and what are some ways that we might be able to support their efforts with this report to go after some things they're excited about. I'll tell you some things that graduate schools are concerned about these days. They're doing surveys of graduate students 2-3 years out of their program to see whether they're hired or not, whether they're working in their discipline or not. One of the things that we have to keep in mind all the time when we're talking about this engaged research impact is that graduate school is changing. It has to. Like, we're producing far too many graduate students than we have faculty positions to take them. And more graduate students are super excited about trying to think about their career outside of academia. And so this has a good win-win situation for graduate schools that are trying to rethink what it means to educate graduate students. There's also, like in the most recent graduate student survey that they put out, one of the things that they mentioned graduate students were very little prepared to do was how to use their disciplinary knowledge in applied settings. That's something that we don't train graduate students very well to do. And that's a big, that sort of toehold for this organization or an initiative Engaged Cornell to say, look, here's something that we can work on. Yeah. So I think the conversation is very new, but one of the things that would be great to see, and I don't know, is like on this public engagement council, how is the graduate school being involved? How are grants that we're putting out, for different departments and different teachers? How are those focusing at all, or if at all, on graduate student outcomes, graduate student research, graduate student education, etc. It's odd for me to be very focused on the graduate student population, but we're quite large here. And in many ways, being a Research One institution, like, we bring some bread and butter to the situation, and a lot of labor. Yeah. So I think that all these questions are really integral to how we think about moving forward. And I'm excited to talk to the graduate school. Okay.
I look forward to reading the full report. Thank you for obviously a lot of energy and work that went into this. I hope to learn some more just by reading more. Sort of my suggestion / question is, fundamentally, I think what we're all engaged with is like trying to help an institution evolve in a direction that we would like. So the question I have is really about what do we know, what informs how we think about this in terms of theories of institutional change, and to me it seems like we don't have enough internal dialogue about how institutions change. And I noticed that one of the papers that, or one of the citations you have in here was David Greenwood's paper with Martin Levin. And way back when CPARN was very strong and active, I remember one of the most, it's not my area, institutional change I don't really study, but I remember that Levin in particular had some really deep insights in some lectures that I went to about how to change institutions from the inside. And it just seems to me like that we could all benefit from, I'm sure there's a lot of expertise in that within this room, but we could all benefit from a more sort of focused dialogue about how the kinds of recommendations you're making and other people have made relate back to the idea of how change, the institution happens, which inherently goes back to the kinds of things we were talking about earlier, like what really is the structure of this university and how the different parts relate to it, which probably very few people have a very good overview of.
So someone want to speak to that in regard, and also in regards to like Bristol things. That was a huge discussion.
Yeah, I think we'll kick it off and then
Okay.
folks can add in with our time in Bristol too. Yeah, because I think from our perspective, and we touched upon this, it's like top-down public engagement. It's kind of ironic, right? And I think that what a lot of graduate students that we talk with who are actually, remember, these are the students who are actively wanting to be engaged in public engagement and are already doing it themselves, often didn't even understand what the governance structure was of the university and also the governance structure of the Engage Cornell hadn't launched by the time we did all this research before the endowment came into effect. So I think a lot of the governance questions are still being worked out. But what we were really excited about is we saw so much energy about we want to be a part of this. But it's one of these things where graduate students are all so busy already. It's not like graduate students are going to go to the provost's office and say, can you sign me up for this? How do I get involved? So I think what we saw was this kind of, well, no one's reaching out to us. We don't really know how it works, so we're just going to kind of continue on our path. We're going to create these informal networks, and we're going to work together. We really support this report. We support this project. So I think what we've really learned is that the energy and will is there. We just have to think about how to make that happen. And I think sometimes it gets to a question of this university asking some really tough questions about sharing power and maybe the ways we haven't seen Cornell share power with graduate students. We're often, told just keep working hard, work on your dissertation. You're going to get to be part of faculty governance when you get a faculty position after grad school. Well, why can't that, some of us, exactly, why can't that start in grad school? Why can't we have more a seat at the table and more engagement? Because the will is really there, and I think, especially around public engagement, that's where the energy is when you really create spaces to engage graduate students, and I think we'll see a big shift if we can do that. But it means Cornell may be asking some tough questions about how it's currently being governed.
I'd just like to mention that at Bristol, that's one of the things that we were going there to workshop. It's just like, what are so we're talking with people from 14 different institutions across the world, and institutions, like whether they're here or elsewhere, often move in a similar fashion. They're kind of sticky. And so I think that's one of the things that we really got from the Bristol conversation, and there's a lot of different viewpoints on that. In some ways, like, people can take a very pessimistic viewpoint of, like, well, the only way that you can move a big institution is by publicly shaming them. But when you talk to someone in Day Hall, the person that they might say, has the most power, over their decision making is the one making the most noise. And so, who knows? These are really big questions. But I know that, at least for my sake, I don't think it's the GPSA that's going to, be my route to political representation in this sort of discussion. Yeah.
Could I just make one act, because it kind of comes up to me when I listen to the way we're just talking about things, which is sort of the discussion of Cornell as if it is some single entity. Which is, I think, and the reason I'm saying that is because I think that's part of what I'm trying to say, until you understand how the institutions come together and where the sources of power and authority and opportunity that are unrelated to obvious sources of power and authority really lie, you don't understand the possibilities for change in an institution. And I think I think about this particularly about how the way that, try and explain what extension is to somebody who's even been here 10 or 15 years, and there's not an easy answer. Who makes decisions, about what kinds of things? It's a very complicated system that we're in, and I don't think we do enough to sort of think through what it all means.
Yeah.
And I think that the problem with that is that it actually handicaps us in going forward when we think about it too simplistically.
And just one quick follow-up is I do think that we have gotten some guidance around Cornell in particular. It's a very tries to operate very autonomously, which makes doing university-wide programs very difficult because, well, one dean could decide that we just don't do that here, and that's that. And so I think that, you know, like, you have to think politically about what are the centers of power, where are these sort of leverage change points, and how do we, you know, work towards, you know, activating them. That's a lot of extra work for graduate students who, and I don't want to be like playing the violin here, but it's like, that's a lot of extra work that we didn't necessarily sign up for, but we're happy to take it on. And I want to make sure we get like a line of questions. So we've got, I'll go one, and then Kathy, and back to the back. Yes.
Yeah, so.
I'm sorry. And over here. We'll go 1, 2, 3, 4.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to, two things, respond to David the way you did, actually, which is, who is we, right? That's the problem, or one of the problems. But in the spirit of Morton Levine, I really think it's an organizing campaign that has to happen. And you guys have started it. This is just such beautiful work that you've done. I'm so excited to be here, and I think you've done a great thing. And unfortunately, organizing is slogging and carrying on and keeping going, and you can hold your violin, but you're still going to do it. So that's one way it's going to happen. Sally, were you next?
I'm kind of just maybe going back to something a little bit more preliminary, but in terms of the voices of the people that you talk to, I mean, what did you find about what are values that graduate students hold towards engagement here? What are the necessary principles? Was there a lot of conflict, or how did you come to that? And then is there anything about that that's uniquely Cornell, or how does it fit in with your research about other institutions? Because maybe that could also be a selling point for some of the recommendations.
So I can touch on that a little bit. So the research that we did on other institutions was more on an institutional level. We didn't actually interview graduate students at other institutions, but that would be a really fascinating sort of new avenue to take this, to sort of compare the research agendas of students at Cornell versus maybe other land-grant institutions or other Research One institutions. But when you ask about how did you put it, the morals or the
values?
The values.
If you were trying to explain to someone in the administration what it is you're trying to promote, what would that be?
There's like a bunch of words that just sort of started springing into my mind, and the first one was accountabilities. Like, most of the graduate students that we spoke with who are either interested in or doing participatory, community engaged, how many of the buzzwords you want to throw together, research, were really concerned about their accountabilities to their research participants and to the communities within which they're working, and juggling that with the accountabilities that they have to their departments, to their supervisors, to writing articles and papers and job, searches and all of those other sort of institutionally mandated responsibilities. So juggling those accountabilities to set up a research agenda that really does favor the interests of the communities that they're working with. And one person in particular that we interviewed, I think it was you that interviewed him, spoke about this sort of almost like a phylogenetic tree of decisions that you make as you go down the river of doing your research. Sorry for the mixed metaphors.
Page 19.
Yeah. And he talked about, the way that your question is formed. So who forms the question, and what's informing the ways that you think about your research question? And does it come from the literature, or does it come from a community experience or a community connection or an interest that is already existing? Maybe a research agenda that's already been putting forth that you can step in and support. So a lot of students were really interested in sort of a reformulation of how we think about research questions. So accountabilities and research question, and then getting away from this sort of like individualistic model. One of the professors that we interviewed spoke about how there's almost this very neoliberal agenda within universities of students coming in thinking of themselves as a consumer, as a customer, right? That the university has to serve us because we are here, either as paying students or not. But that what about, what if you came into the university and you just joined right in on a research team and got like right away in the field experience instead of spending 2 years doing coursework and then going into the field like in your third, fourth, fifth, whatever year.
sort of turn it on its head, the model of education that we have, and to treat students as part of ongoing processes rather than as sort of individuals with their individualized desires as to how their education might be structured. I'm not sure if I'm articulating that well, but did you guys want to jump in on that?
I'd just add one little quip. Is that like the people's stories of how they came to do engaged research, like I'm very excited about those. And a lot of times it involves someone that, you know, has a committed relationship to a community that might be their own or their parents. They have work that they started out there that they're going back to. That's a really interesting story. Like they're coming here to get better at something that they know they need to get better at out there. And I think that, honestly, Cornell has a very large competitive advantage within that kind of work. Like, I would wager to say that a lot of graduate students that are here, this wasn't their safety school. There's a reason that they're here, and it's because there's an ag focus here, or there's an animal science focus here, or there's an applied math focus here. Like, they're coming here because they're like, that's where I can get the education that I need to go do this thing that I'm really invested in. And I think that Cornell has that, and I think it's a competitive advantage that other people don't have necessarily. And so we should capitalize on that. And that's probably the most capitalistic you'll ever hear me talk. So,
I think it was Sally and then
Tim.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I thought you made such insightful recommendations. I mean, that really cut in deeply, cross-cutting into some very complicated layers of, well, we'll just leave it at that. But so I'm curious about if you had a chance to think about the possibilities that might be inherent in the way Engaged Cornell is currently structured. And I understand it will grow and change as it. But the current focus on undergraduate coursework and creating these very engaged courses, if you've had a chance to think about how that might, the implications that might have for the graduate students attached to those courses, and if you're going to be a graduate student as a TA or a research assistant attached to very project-focused courses, how that might open up some possibilities for change in the graduate student experience.
Yes, I think that that's a good thing, and one of the things that we're trying to focus on here is really that research question. It's one of the things that's curious for me is how engagement has rolled out in various universities, and in particular the difference between how engagement's rolled out in the U.S. and how engagement's rolled out in some of the social democracies in Northern Europe. Like here, one of the strategies I think is to start with this idea of undergraduate educational experiences, service learning. That's how we get people started on this idea that engagement is a good thing and brings us a return, you know, once again slipping into that language. But I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of universities in Northern Europe, like they start with the research question. Because the research question and getting communities involved in what you're thinking about, how you produce knowledge, not how you teach it, but how you produce knowledge, like that's a real sort of toehold. And I think that there's a good synergy there. Like you can have research that's engaged with real world problems that are being led, you know, by junior faculty members. How awesome would that be? And you can have them involved in teaching students that are involved in this process as well. So it's just a question of where we start and where we meet up. But yeah, I think graduate students being involved in coursework, in more sort of engaged pedagogies is a great idea. But I also think that there's also a lot of work that's been done at this campus around that. Richard's work at the Center for Teaching Excellence and how that's continued on is a great place to point to, where graduate students are being trained in how to do, you know, service learning activities when they become future faculty. That's great, but it still, to some extent, doesn't touch on that research question. Sometimes it talks about, you know, like, oh, how can we do research on the pedagogy to make the pedagogy better? But I want to go a little bit deeper and say, like, how can we, you know, build knowledge in engaged ways? Like, that's a question that I, as a graduate student, want to be involved in. So, thank you. Yes.
So, this is great. I really appreciate it. I want to give you another metaphor for this work that you've done, which is really helpful. It reminds me a little bit of what I know of neurochemistry, and you're laying down more tracks. You're making this a more solid, a more likely to be followed path. And and I wish you well. I've been lurking around the edges of CPARN for years and watching you guys do your stuff and then taking off to other parts of the world. And I'm really, this is going to make it better for future grad students. And also, hopefully, I like how you have included extension and resources into making those tracks stronger. So just a couple thoughts and suggestions and a question. First of all, Todd, when you said that a lot of times people, grad students may not be using the term engaged, I don't dislike the term, but I totally agree when you said, I mean, I'm more likely to refer to a lot of my research and methodology as collaborative or participatory. And I think that keeping engaged, but making sure that your definitions that, you know, kind of early on in people's understanding of what we're trying to do here, what you're trying to do here, has to do with collaboration and engagement and participatory ways of creating knowledge. And also applied, you know, then turning around, applying, evaluating, etc. The do-it-yourself autodidactic thing, absolutely. I mean, I've been here longer than any of you, but not as long as. And you know, there's part of it's thrilling to have to put something together and, you know, do that thing that Ezra Cornell said. You know, anybody can study anything. I just really into that saying. But it's also hard and lonely. So what you're doing is, and the center is kind of laying down tracks for, is creating more space. And Justine, when you said growing grad student networks, I'm wondering, and I'm sure you've already, it's probably in your report, but an idea of having grad students get together on a regular basis, once a week, I don't know what you suggested, in the center. I mean, that's a great space. And there's space near there, and it's also in Caldwell where the grad school is, and so that's a good space. I'm sure they have a Keurig machine and whatever. And another thing, connecting with the Liberty High Bailey and the land grant history is huge, and I don't think a lot of people, hopefully everyone in this room, but that heritage, that legacy is really cool. And I mean, even almost sexy in terms of its land, biology, plants. Liberty High Bailey and his cohort of people were exciting and something to be kind of proud of. Not in a nationalistic, silly way, but these were great scholars, and I think bear lifting up. I know that I don't know if he's here, but there's a recent lecture given on Liberty High Bailey's writings, etc. He's very interesting. So I just have two questions. Thanks for bearing with me. One is that Mary Jo already brought up extension in CALS and in the development sociology. I'm wondering if and you guys actually didn't have to do this in your report. This is more of a question for Engaged at Cornell, I guess. Are we providing or putting out funding or scholarship for graduate students to work with the farm workers program, for instance, or other? I mean, that is some of the best work we're doing here, is that kind of thing. So I'm very interested in seeing that happen, even though I'm not directly involved in it. I really believe in it, and I think it's a strength that we have. And then I haven't heard too much, but again, this may not be you guys, maybe this is Engaged Cornell in general. How does this stuff, do you feel like it translates into international stuff as well? Because, for instance, that's one of the reasons why I may not have hovered more closely towards CPARN. So I'm wondering how those might come together, because there is a fair amount of international. So that's, thanks.
So before I get to your questions, or before we get to your questions, I want to just touch on one thing you said about the grad student networks. And it's something that everybody really wants. All of our research participants throughout the study really wanted a better model of engaging with other grad students. It's also really hard to bring grad students together.
Yeah.
So as much as we really want it, none of us really have time for it. Because the model is so time consuming, our classwork and our research and the writing and everything, we started, or actually Bradley Kinsey, who did the design of our report, started a group called Public last year through ELNR, and we met 4 or 5 times maybe. There was always, 4 or 5 students there, and it sort of fizzled when Bradley finished his degree. It's a model that we would love to see take back off and maybe re-engage CPARN with something like that. But we have to figure out a way to make it worth all of our time, right? Like whether that looks like a sharing of research and a critiquing of people's work, or like reading things together and discussing new literature, or hearing speakers that can somehow contribute to the methodologies that we're employing. So it's definitely something that's very central to what a lot of people are thinking about. But it's really difficult to get grad student commitment to something that's like, that takes up yet another hour out of your week, or 2 hours out of your week.
I wanted to just add it on the history piece. Touched a little bit upon it when I was speaking, but that connection between the new framing of public engagement and then our history, I think, is really important. And I don't know what other people in the room, if they noticed or had the same reaction I did, I was saddened when land grant came off of the homepage and public engagement replaced it, because no matter what we say here, it is a part of our heritage and our legacy. And so I think that it was very clear when you were talking with administrators and folks around campus, but public engagement includes land grants, so we're good, kind of thing. But it's still really important to look back at our history and see how that connects. And I think we could do a better job. I think we're in such an amazing, and you're talking about this unique place of Cornell, we're in such an amazing moment where we have a $150 million endowment that, this is what most universities would be thrilled to have. We're in a really great position financially, but there is always that press of it's a new thing, it's something new, we're starting fresh, this is new, but we really have it in our history and our legacy. So I would really encourage all of us in the university, but especially those directly overseeing Engage Cornell, to really think about how can we better tie our history to the current practice and also the government structure. So, yeah.
I just want to say really quickly, I didn't want to just lead, but I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who came today, and I just again applaud all the amazing work the grad students did. And I look forward to, if anybody has any questions for me and engage in research, and if I can be helpful, just contact me at RCK6 at Cornell. I'd be happy to provide as much information and feedback as possible. So,
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
And then Lisa had one more. Yeah.
And we didn't touch on any of your questions.
Oh, yeah.
But the first question, remind me, was about funding opportunities for programs like farm workers.
Well, so just to give you a specific, if you do engagement well, that's not rewarded with this new money. This new money is for creating new things.
Okay.
And that's something where if the graduate students were involved in decisions or directions for the future, that would be something where I would encourage grad students to think about that.
Right.
And in my recommendations, or the recommendations that I read, it's about more robustly funding extension, including Cal's extension, in the work that they are doing, to provide them with the ability, the time, the space, the funding to work with grad students. Because like John said, we take a lot of time, and it is, you're working with new students over the course of years. It takes time and effort, and for you to have to raise the money to do that, it becomes really prohibitive. And it's part of what silos us away from each other, is the fact that we're all sort of concerned with funding ourselves.
But I think this would take a concerted effort, because as it is now, that's not part of the game.
Yeah, and we said, verbatim in one section of the report, something that I don't know how people would approach it. We were like, if this, it's the same thing that's happened with university publications. Like, university publications got into this cost recovery mode, like in the 60s. Like in the same way with extension, it's in cost recovery mode. It's not a money sink for the university. It's like, oh, how can we do this in a way that we don't have to fund it through our central endowment sort of thing. And we said, if this work is going to be supported, we're going to have that conversation of why does the university not endow and support institutions like Cooperative Extension through hard money, not soft money.
And similarly, the whole promotion process within the extension world, there's no plus of working with students.
Right.
So that is your choice. That's how you're spending your time. But in the promotion channel, that's
not valued. And similarly, tenure, promotion, community engaged research is not valued. A lot of professors will not put it on their CV, will not talk about it when it comes time that they're going up for tenure because it is not valued.
And one of the things that I wish we'd have gotten around to while everyone was still in the room, like, how many tenure track professors are sitting in the room right now?
Are you actually asking?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, okay. All right. And so, and you know, like, and a further question is like, how many tenure track how many tenure track professors are there in the room that don't have like a high administrative appointment? Like, we don't get like with all these taxes for time and funding efforts and like where I spend my effort. Like, it's hard to get the right people in the room.
Yeah.
Like, yep. Yes, Ken. Or, oh, I'm sorry.
Risa had one, and then
That's one of the wrong people in the room.
You're one of the right people.
In a good way. In a good way. No, I think this is such a good discussion, and thank you so much for putting the time in. But I think what's interesting is that what comes out of the work we're doing and the discussion we're doing is always that you start with kind of a particular focus, and then you realize as soon as you have the particular focus, it happily cracks open a whole lot of other questions. And so, you know, there are certain short-term goals that I think that you've defined, which are really good, your short-term recommendations, but it's those underlying fissures that exist, and that as soon as we enter into something like engaged learning, we ask, okay, how serious is this? What does it mean? What does it mean in a world where the university is becoming more corporate, that we have this you know, increased interest in engaged learning? You know, what is there a disconnect there? Obviously the answer is yes. But that, you know, that you are necessarily, and I think in a very important way, raising issues about, as was said earlier, who are we as an institution, and what kind of institutions do you want to help shape as graduate students go into it? So it's got to be, of course, beyond what you're doing, but it's those questions that you're raising which are asking about unseating received wisdom that goes well beyond the specific funding issues, and that deals with things like how can a university that cares about engaged learning actually have these stratification of faculty in a way that keeps people off tenure track lines and doesn't ask about how to, you know, reevaluate ideas about reward structures, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you should really press on those issues and recognize that they're institutional identity issues in addition to your sort of short-term questions. And one I would just add into it is, why are graduate students so busy that you don't have time to work on this? You know, and again, back to what Todd had said in terms of looking at history, the kind of speed up that graduate students have been pressured into to say, get your degree and get out of here because your funding is going to get cut off. You know, that was a discussion that we had on campus, a very short discussion. I was the only person who opposed it at a faculty meeting that was held about 8 years ago. I said, this is an old-fashioned speed up, and graduate students should not be pressured to leave. So, you know, questioning that received wisdom, I think, is essential.
Thank you so much.
You know, there's a couple things that so I've been involved in some of this stuff for years. Two things that I think would be incredibly helpful, would have been really helpful for me as I've gone through my career. It is much more knowledge about both theoretical and practical around community organizing, and much more knowledge around systems thinking, systems work. And both of these, I mean, it was talked about earlier, community organizing is a key piece of this. Another, and it was implied through what David Kay said, that the systems thinking piece and analysis of the systems is really critical to begin to analyze where the pressure points are, the leverage points. And the fact is that no matter where you go, whatever career you take, both of those are absolutely critical. You can master those well. Google, I think Barack Obama is an example of somebody who demonstrated some of that, right? Not in what he did at the end to get there. The point is that if you don't have time, putting time into those two pieces, and here at Cornell you can design courses, you can develop your own independent study courses. There are people on campus who know systems thinking, who are really good systems thinking developers and so on. And so there is scope. And what I would suggest, if this whole issue of when one graduate student leaves, the whole thing sort of disappears. It wouldn't if you basically began to develop, especially the systems piece, the systems analysis, because that you're never going to get the whole answer, and it's always changing. So it's always valuable for the next person coming in. It's not as if they have to reinvent anything, but if you've got some documentation there, they can continue to build off of it. And you won't waste any of your time because it's all time that you'll use to develop skills that you're going to use wherever you go.
And just a real quick point is that sometimes graduate students underestimate their power, often. And this whole speeding up is another issue with that. But you have tremendous power. You really have a lot of leverage to bring about change, not just for yourselves, but for the institution. And the farm worker program wouldn't exist if graduate students hadn't pushed for it. So you have more power than you think. And this whole keeping you busy so you feel like you're chaotic all the time is a way of decreasing your power. So just think about that yourself collectively, that you have tremendous power.
Thank you.
That's such a great ending.
Right on.
Inspirational.
Slow down.
Let's slow down. Slow down the rest of the day.
It's a very good labor organizing metaphor, right?
Just,
slow down.
Just to close it out, we want to thank everyone so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support throughout the process, and we look forward to being in touch with you. Make sure to sign up if you want to get the report and hear about our next steps as we move this forward.
Well done.
Thank you.